Welcome to the Essential Tax Podcast with your host, Mishkin Santa. In each episode, we'll take the complex world of tax, all the jargon, acronyms, and stuff that make your eyes glaze over, and explain it in an impactful way to understand the complex and unknown areas. You can find this show on all the major platforms, including YouTube, LinkedIn, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and on our website, thewolfgroup.com. Now, here's the host of Essential Tax Podcast, Mishkin Santa.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to the podcast. David, welcome to the podcast. How are you, sir?
I'm doing great. Thank you very much. Happy to be here.
Oh, excellent. So today's podcast is one that's very near and dear to my heart. A lot of times when we're doing the podcast or we're talking about tax issues, we're really just getting into the meat and potatoes of economic effects to people that mostly are high net worth or have business economic activities. But today's show is something that I've been long wanting to talk about. And at the Wolf Group, we do sometimes what's called pro bono tax compliance work. We do that sometimes for individuals that have significant mental or physical issues. And then a couple of years back, we were reached out to by the State Department to see if we may be able to help some victims of human trafficking that had sought asylum inside the United States. They were on special visas. They're tax residents for U.S. tax purposes. And in many cases, they received certain settlements, which is always a tricky area for tax, even if you're not, a victim of human trafficking. I think that's an area that I know a lot of people struggle with. I know a lot of attorneys fear the tax code, even though they're attorneys. They're not a big fan of the tax code or understanding the differences between when a settlement is paid out, about how, whether that's taxable, non-taxable. So there's that aspect. And then what I find is once they get through that process, and I'll let David's going to explain all this to us. We'll let David give his background and explain why he's here today. But the other thing that I've noticed is that then they're here in the U.S., they want to be here, they feel safe here, and they have to continue filing tax returns. And it can be a very scary proposition. It can be a difficult thing to do. Sometimes they hold a wide variety of jobs and reporting. So at the Wolf Group, in cases like that, we'll help them do their tax return pro bono, meaning no service charge or fee on that. But there can be a lot of hand-holding there. There can be language barriers there. There can be trust issues that have to be overcome. So it's an issue that I've long been a proponent for. I think more tax firms in the United States should have programs like this, should participate in. The IRS has two different clinics that they do for folks, which one is called VITA, one's called LITC. And this current climate that we're seeing with all the executive orders and the funding, the limited funding of the IRS, I think both those programs are going to have some issues. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But let me pause because I've gone on a little bit of a diatribe there. David, why don't you tell the audience, tell our folks that are listening today, tell them your background, who you are, and kind of what you're getting into with the Victims for Human Trafficking.
Sure, absolutely. Thank you very much. So my professional background is mostly in management consulting and finance. And I realized as my two children, who are now both young adults, were growing up, that they didn't really have the tools that they needed from a kind of overall financial literacy perspective of just managing their lives as they became adults. Some basic things, some of them, generational. My son didn't know how to write a check because he never had to write a check before, and we don't write checks very often, but it's a skill that, one should know how to do, even if you do it once a year. So it was in the kind of the throes of COVID, and, we were all home sort of together, and my wife and I spent a lot of time with them, just sort of going through. I created like 100-slide deck of everything you could possibly ever want to know, from savings account, investing accounts, taxes, were certainly a big part of it. Some things very specific to our family, estate planning, insurance, what to do in the case of an emergency. I mean, sort of every topic you could think of. And So I started to spend some time doing some coaching and doing some kind of financial literacy training. I became certified as a certified financial educator instructor. A friend of ours had founded an organization called the Human Trafficking Legal Center, I think about 10 or 12 years ago.
Oh, wow.
And, her organization helps trafficking victims seek justice, usually through civil claims. So often, if there was a criminal situation, that has already been dealt with through the Department of Justice or, kind of whoever handles that. And they hook up trafficking victims with lawyers who will provide pro bono services to help them try to get civil judgments, as restitution for what they went through. We were having dinner, our families were having dinner, and we were all talking kind of about what we were doing. And she said, what you're doing is something that her clients really need. And it's not something that her organization was really, it was slightly outside the mission really of her organization, because they were very focused on kind of the legal aspect and the civil judgments.
Right.
She asked me if, two things, if I could help kind of one specific person who needed some assistance. And then also we talked about just doing some training for some of the people that she works with. So that was sort of how I got involved with that situation. And, Mishkin, as you know, the person that I'm helping is someone who your firm helps with her taxes, so that's, kind of how we got connected. And I thought, as I was listening to the intro video, that said, I don't know, I'm going to paraphrase, but, something like, talking about topics that often cause, you kind of your eyes to glaze over. And I think that's true for sort of, the average person, right, in the United States. And then if you think about, and one can imagine sort of what the backgrounds and what the lives have been like of some of these people who have been trafficked, and then think about their perspective on some of these topics, it's kind of to another level in terms of trying to wrap their head around what's going on and the trust issues that you mentioned. And so it's something really important that people need help with.
Yeah. So, and to give an example, and I mentioned this earlier, a lot of these people have multiple jobs. Sometimes they're employees, sometimes they're contractors, right? And I'm not certain they quite understand the difference between, what's a 401k, or if I'm self-employed, can I do a SEP IRA, why it's important to plan for retirement and for your future, and then that's from a tax perspective, right? I mean, I'm not even getting into estimated tax payments, qualified, but there's all sorts of stuff for the tax return, qualified business income deduction, Schedule C reporting in home office. I mean, there's all sorts of things that from a tax efficiency standpoint that I think a lot of these people never go down the pipeline on that. And they kind of stay very, very much at the top. No one ever gives them that kind of advice or that value add, nor do they know to ask for it. And then on your end, I think the question becomes, what do I do with my after-tax dollars? How do I deal with, how do I run a budget? How do I run a household? Do you want to talk a little bit about your kind of approach and the things that you're advising on? I'm also interested to know, do these people, are you meeting with them in person particularly? Or they're very coy about doing things online? How is the communication process working with that?
Yeah, absolutely. Starting with that last part first, I think what I've noticed is there's such a wide range of kind of experiences and even kind of life skills. So the person, the person that you and I have in common, we meet in person. I mean, we'll text and every now and then there'll be something relatively simple that I'll see if we can try to get done online. But even basic things like, how do I DocuSign a document?
Right.
Can cause anxiety. How do I join a Zoom call? If I only have my phone and I don't have access to a computer, I can't, I don't have access to a printer. So if I want to print something out, it's a problem. So, and I've had to really take a step back, and my ultimate goal, right, is to get to the point where people need less and less help, right, where they should be able to do some of these things on their own, right, and to make them self-sufficient. Maybe not filing their, preparing their tax return, but going through it the first time and looking at it and understanding it, and then maybe asking a question or two. So it's really been having to kind of recalibrate my thinking in terms of how we do things and meeting the person where they are. And there's a range. I mean, there's from the extreme that I was just talking about of, I don't know how to DocuSign something on my phone. So can you print it out and can we meet in person so I can physically sign it? Versus, to people who are in situations that you were describing, who have multiple jobs and have a couple of W-2s and they're contractors and they want to know about home office deductions and a little more savvy maybe in terms of the tech world and how things work. So it's very, very person specific. And I found that in these two avenues that I'm working on right now, where we're doing some general education in sort of a group setting, kind of a Zoom meeting where we'll go through a couple of topics and talk about credit scores and credit reporting, or talk about taxes and what is estimated taxes and how do I pay them and things like that, all the way down to the brass tacks of how do I file my taxes, and not surprisingly, everybody's situation is so specific, where people want information, but what they really want are answers to the questions that are specific to them, right?
And so how do you do that? I mean, what happens if the person doesn't want to share their story? Like, I get what you're saying, right? You're trying to figure out how is the best way to communicate with this person, right? What's their, and to do that, you kind of, like an attorney does, you got to ask like a bunch of different questions and you kind of get to know them really well. But what happens if they really don't want to share much about themselves, or it's very difficult to tease that out of them? Do you have an approach for that? Have you run into any roadblocks there?
It's really, it's kind of sensing when to push a little bit or when to back off. And I think doing things like taking the extra step to meet in person, that sort of thing goes a long way. So, some of the things that we've done with the person that I've been helping kind of one-on-one, I'm sure that if we had pushed through, we could have figured out a way to do things online. But realizing that it made more sense to kind of meet her at a place where she was comfortable, like we usually meet at a public library, someplace that, that's kind of in the open. And I think that goes a long way. And I think her realizing she's in Virginia, I'm in DC, frankly, it's not the most convenient thing for me to go to Fairfax to, meet somebody, but that's okay. Like, I'm happy to do it, because I think that is what is getting her more comfortable with sharing some of that information and talking about some of the things that are relevant to the tax, to the tax situation. So it's really step by step, and it's a process.
Okay. Yeah, I figured as much. In my experience with this, I always want to make them feel as comfortable as possible. And I'm kind of like you, like, even if it's slightly inconvenient to me, I will go ahead and take that extra step. Maybe I'll stay an hour longer after work, or, normally I would just do it over a Teams or Zoom call. I'm like, hey, let's get them in the office and I'll just meet with them one-to-one. And, we try to limit the time from my time, to 15, 30 minutes. But if I need to sit there and make them feel comfortable with it, and, sometimes they really want to understand it and they want the full, explanation. What does this line mean? What does that line mean? And I think by taking that time and not letting the pressure, the normal pressures there kind of overwhelm you a little bit, I think goes a really long way. Going back to the I know I kind of did a couple questions there and there, but
yeah.
Tell me about some things, though, that you, from a financial perspective, that you'll advise them on. Like, let's make an assumption that they've gotten some kind of monetary reward So they've got maybe a lump sum of cash sitting in a bank account, and they're maybe working, some type of job that pays them a normal income for whatever they do. What are you then? And it's just them, right? And they're living in, let's say, Virginia.
Yeah.
What are you then trying to counsel them on?
Yeah. So you had mentioned budgeting, right? So that's obviously a big one. And in situations where people, and you're absolutely right, like a lot of people have these kind of multiple income streams, and budgeting can be challenging, right? In that situation, especially, on the income side, especially, right? When you don't know, you have a sense of what your W-2 income is going to be like, but the 1099 income varies, can vary quite a bit.
Right.
So spending quite a bit of time on the expense side, and just, kind of budgeting 101, like getting people to think in terms of discretionary versus non-discretionary. I have some kind of housing cost, maybe I have an auto loan, I need food, right? I have to pay my utilities. What are the buckets of those expenses that, at least in the short term, I can't change, that I know I have to pay these expenses every month, and we were just talking about this yesterday. There's so many apps out there. You could do things in Google Sheets or Excel. There's lots of different apps, and they kept, what's the best one? Like, what's the one I should use? And I said several times, like, honestly, a lot, they're all very similar, and the best one to use is the one that you're going to use.
Right.
So it's a little bit of trial and error. Everybody has, personal preferences for what kinds of things they like. And whether they want to use an app or whether they want to use a spreadsheet. And it's just like seeing what you have and seeing what you will actually use and what will be helpful for decision making. So that's one thing. Definitely, budgeting is a thing where we spend some time. Credit scores and credit reporting. It's getting people to understand, I guess, a couple things. First, just how it works and what it means, and why it's important, for someone to know what their credit report looks like and what their credit score is, even if they're not in the process of looking for a new place to live or getting some kind of loan, because it takes time to change your credit score. If you want to do things to try to bring it up to, have a better situation where you're getting a car loan, for example, it can just take time, and it can take a lot of phone calls, especially if there's errors on it. There's legislation called the Debt Bondage Repair Act, which lays out a process for people who are victims of trafficking and have things on their credit report that are a result of trafficking, how to have those removed. So if their traffickers opened accounts in their name or did things that had an adverse effect on their credit, there's a process for getting those things removed. And not surprisingly, it's not always quick, right? It will work, but it takes time. It also doesn't alleviate debt collectors from trying to collect on that debt if it's in your name. It just gets it off your credit report. So making sure that they understand why it's important to take a look at their credit report and come up with a plan, if for whatever needs to be done. And then I think the last part of it is really on the investing. What do I do if I have this settlement? What should I do with it? And that's tricky. I don't do a lot of that. I'm not a certified financial planner. I don't feel comfortable giving investment advice to other people. So I'll spend more time talking in general about what investing versus savings means. What are equities versus bonds? What are people talking about? Why interest rates matter, things like that. And then, hopefully that's enough information for them to sort of get started on their own, or, in some situations, try to hook them up with someone who has the right credentials to actually provide specific advice for their situation.
Okay. So I want to just briefly go into a tax issue that I've seen a couple times. And you mentioned it earlier. So you're a victim of human trafficking. They have your identity, and in some cases they use it to open up fraudulent accounts, or they do things. They also do that with taxes. They will file false tax returns to try to claim refunds. And so what happens is that, you could get a client, or, one of these folks that comes through, and you're filing tax returns and they expect a refund. And then they're calling me up and they're saying, I never got my refund. Why didn't I get my refund? And then you look into it and there's this massive tax bill on their account. And it's because of the identity theft fraud that occurred during that. And there's a whole way to combat that, to deal with the IRS on it. I think the problem with it, though, is a couple things. One is you've got to get an identity PIN, and that PIN has to be renewed every single year. So when your tax return, when you're filing it, they'll give you a new PIN.
Right.
You have to make sure to enter it in there. You have to do an identity theft case with the IRS. There's a special form you fill out called the 14039. The average processing time to complete an identity theft case with the IRS, and this is prior to the recent cuts in the IRS workforce, but prior to that was 675 days. I mean, it's a tremendous amount of time for them to investigate those and to try to put relief around it. You can do what are called offers in compromise. Doubt as to liability is a different way to kind of combat that. I think I also tell clients, and you have some insight into this, you can file an ID theft affidavit with the FTC. I think you also have to do that with the 3 credit bureaus. My guess is that like you said, you're pulling credit reports to check on those. I think there was a government website called annualcreditreport.com or something like that you would go to get that info.
Yeah, you can get them free, like once a year. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a massive undertaking, and it's kind of like once they get through the criminal and the civil, there's still a lot of these pieces that are there that that they don't really understand, and they can't connect the dots. But when I see it, I know automatically that it's going to be a long slog, and there's going to be a huge commitment of time to help resolve that. So certainly that's there. And then, do you ever get questions that you don't necessarily want to provide advice, but maybe you just turn that off for a second and say, look, this is just me coming to you as a friend here for a second. Like if they're asking you about, should I sign up for, this online cell service with these 6 add-on components? And in your head, you're like, you don't need all that. You don't need you don't need the 6 additional phone lines and the, add-ons. Do you ever make any comments like that about, be careful about people taking advantage of your being naive to the situation?
So not specifically, I haven't come across that kind of specific situation, but what I have noticed is kind of the opposite situation of when you were asking, how do you get people comfortable, with sharing their stories and what I've noticed sometimes is we'll be working on something and I'll say, so, we'll kind of go through, this is what this means, this is what that means, you need to sign here. And they'll want to just go, okay, like I'll just sign, like here, it's all done. And, and it's, like taking a step back and saying, right, of course, like that's my goal, right? Is I want to get the thing signed so it can be filed. But it's really important for them to make sure, I want to make sure they understand what it is that they're signing, and going back and saying, okay, like just to make sure you understand, like, this is why you check no for this box and yes for this box. And this is why you have this form. And honestly, it's not always easy to tell if some of that message is getting through, and I think maybe part of that is, some of the background where they felt like they just sort of did what they were told, right? Like sign this, and don't worry about it. Trust me, like, sign this, like it'll be fine. And, of course I don't have any vested interest in what it is that, doing or anything like that. There's no ulterior motive, but sometimes it can almost be a little frustrating where they want to go too fast. And I want to make sure that they're understanding what they're doing so that if they find themselves in a situation like you were describing, they can take the time and say, do I really need this? Or what is it that this person is asking me to do? Somebody who might have, a financial incentive for them to do something sign up for extra phones they don't need, or, some other service or something like that. We do talk about, and I remember talking about this with my kids, that in the world that we're talking about, whether it be investing or credit cards or taxes, it's very rare that you're presented with something where you truly need to make a decision on the spot, right?
Okay. I agree with that.
Like it's hard to come up with a situation where like somebody says, this is the situation, this is the offer, you either need to sign this or like it's going away forever. Like, doesn't really, especially in investing, but in tax situations as well. So telling people it's okay to say to almost anyone, I need to think about it. Like, I'll get back to you. Let me talk to somebody else. And that can be hard, right? Because you're feeling pressure from somebody's a good salesperson. They're, like pushing hard and they're trying to close the deal. But getting people to that point where they can say, like, no, just like slow down and let me think about it, and I'll call you back or email you back or text you back or whatever.
So let me ask you this. Because my audience tends to be sometimes a lot of CPA firms, tax firms. If another tax firm wanted to get involved with what you're doing or with the center that you're working with, maybe help do tax returns or give presentations or whatever, how would one step forward and say, hey, we want to give back, we want to get involved? How would one get in contact? What would be expected? What resources do you all need here now? We're talking on March 6, 2025. Obviously, the landscape of what's happening in the U.S. is a little bit like this. Yeah. But how can people get involved? How can people help out at the ground level, boots in the ground level?
So I was absolutely hoping you were going to ask that question because I have the information. So the organization that I've spent some time with is called the Human Trafficking Legal Center, HTLC. Okay. And it would be pretty simple. An email to info@htlc.org with just the subject of pro bono services and a description of what it is. Hey, I'm a CPA who, would like to help out. And sending it over to them. And I'm sure that they would be happy to kind of, make that connection. In terms of expectations, this is pro bono, right? So it's really, I think it's whatever the person or the firm, is willing, able to do, whether it's saying, I'm happy to take on one pro bono client, 2 pro bono clients, to help with tax prep, or, as a firm, we can spend, we can take on X number of clients. It's that that really important kind of one-on-one relationship that I think is missing right now. Like there's definitely a need for this kind of overall education, which is helpful, but the services like what you do, where you will say, I will help this person prepare their tax return, that's the kind of, and answer their questions about home office deduction or Schedule C or, whatever it is. That's where the need is really the greatest. So anybody who's interested in helping out, if they get in touch with HTLC and just offer their services, I am certain that they will take them up on whatever it is that they can give.
Yeah, and I would encourage people, I think there's 3 slices here that I would encourage a lot of CPA firms to consider. One is, as if you've been doing this as long as I have, there are predatory firms out there that will take advantage of people on their tax returns. They promise pie in the sky. Oh, I can get you guaranteed 5. I see it all the time. I'm driving, to drop off my dry cleaning. It's a guaranteed refund of $5,000. I'm just like sitting there, like scratching my head, like, how? So there's a lot of those, and people, that's not to say people won't go for that. I mean, people will definitely go for that. So I think there's a conversation that needs to be had about predatory tax preparers. It's not a well-regulated, tax preparers and CPAs. We're not very well regulated. We do have to abide by Circular 230 for ethics. There is a proposed regulations, which I'm writing a blog post on about potential tax preparer regulations. But I feel like a lot of that is more so when you're helping people with really gray areas, like maybe you've got someone with some kind of offshore income or something like that, you give them certain advice. It's, be real careful, because if you give them the wrong advice or you tell them something and then you can get a preparer penalty. But
Right.
I think there needs to be more regulation on those nefarious actors that take advantage of people on their taxes. I think number two is there needs to be some, in my opinion, some general education. I don't know if that's for the actual victims, the actual taxpayers themselves. I'm not sure how much they're going to absorb in that kind of educational seminar, or if it's more for the pro bono folks like yourself, or people that are working with these people, the attorneys, people like yourself, maybe just kind of having a round table to go over the basics, things you probably already know, but maybe just kind of, going around and talking about some high level topics of issues that are commonly seen by people that help out. And then I think you hit the nail on the head. I think the most important part is saying, look, we're going to be available. Our firm's going to be available. We're going to maybe open up the doors on Tuesday and Thursday of next week or 2 weeks from now. Give people a bit of lead time, right? We're in tax season right now.
Right.
We have some volunteers that are going to stay for a couple hours. If your people want to come by after work, because I know it's tough. It's tough to find time to do your taxes if you've got multiple jobs and you've got a lot of things you got to take care of. It's not like you can just email and ping pong back and forth all day like we do with some of our clients. So open up the doors after hours, have some volunteers there, do the intake manually right there and then, get the returns done, do it pro bono. I think that last part is the biggest kind of need that I see. And normally, I mentioned this earlier, normally that's through volunteer income tax clinics and low income taxpayer clinics that the IRS is funding together with the taxpayer advocate. But again, if the funding is cut there and the staffing is cut there, the amount of service that those entities will be able to provide, especially if they lose grants, because that's how a lot of those clinics are paid for, then the ability for those people to be able to get those types of services will dwindle significantly. They'll have less options, and then more likely you're seeing more of them turning to, hopefully not, but that's when I think the nefarious tax preparers kind of jump in and you have a big issue. And that's the self-perpetuating problem that we have going on here.
Right. And I think there, in addition to we've been focused, quite a bit on on returns, but there are also other kind of one-off situations where people need help. The other day I was talking to someone at HTLC and they asked if I knew of anyone who could help one of their clients get a taxpayer ID number, because I don't really know the details, but I'm assuming that, she was in a situation where she hadn't paid taxes and she probably, wanted or needed to start paying taxes, right? And I'm guessing since the question was about a TIN, not a social security number, probably not a citizen under a specific, visa regime. And, and they had said, there are people who will do it. They charge $550, for, to fill out the form. And, that was not what they were looking for, right? And so even helping out with situations like that, where it's sort of a one-off, and somebody who can really give advice on that, because they asked me if I could do it. And I said, that's not what I do. I looked at the form and I said, this is, I'm not a CPA. I don't give tax advice. And I do know from my experiences professionally, if you check the wrong box when you do that kind of thing and get a number, fixing it is very, very difficult. And I don't think we want to put somebody in that situation, so I think it would be better to get someone who kind of is familiar with doing this, so keeping in mind that it might not be a multi-year commitment of, doing a return for this person, kind of every year in, year out, maybe there's, what you were saying, on Tuesdays and Thursdays when sort of the clinic is open, somebody can say, hey, I just need, I need help with this form because I need this ID number. Can you just take a look at it and tell me if it's right? Did I miss anything?
Right.
So there's a range of different services that people need.
And I think, and I'll speak specifically because I'll very quickly give you the cliff notes on the question you just asked for a sec. But I will say, again, going back to lack of IRS funding, lack of IRS staffing, the less the IRS has to be able to work with, the less they can help people out like that. And then I think it becomes incumbent upon the private sector to come out and say, we'll volunteer to do that. We'll take a little bit of that on the chin and help out with that. So I think that's a really important thing. And I think other examples are, I got an IRS notice, or I got a state of Virginia tax notice. I don't know what this means. I don't understand. What do I need to do? Or maybe they get a fraudulent notice. There's a lot of scams going around where it like tells you to do something.
Or a text or an email. Yeah.
And so what do I do there? And they're lost. But real quick, just for the W-7 purposes, that's a really tricky issue, because even at the best of times with the IRS, I see about 50% of those get rejected, even if they're filled out properly. The one thing to note is that if you're eligible for a Social Security number, you can't apply for an ITIN. You have to go back to your immigration attorney and get them to get that social for you. But they have acceptance agents. There's a list of them that I would say that's your best bet. Go fill that form out, I think the biggest problem is that the identity documentation that you have to attach to it to prove who you are.
Yeah.
For example, if I'm trying to get a certified copy of my passport from the issuing authority, and that's a country down in South America that I'm not going to go back to, I can't get that because the issuing authority is down there. And it's like I can walk into the consulate of that country here in the US, and I don't think that works. And so, then you're juggling, okay, well, what do I need to send in? A lot of times they want original documents. And again, victims of human trafficking, they're like, I'm not going to send my, my passport down there. What if the IRS loses that? Or I'm not going to send my state driver's license to them. I'm not going to. So that's where I think the problems come in at. And I've long advocated that I think the IRS could do that process a lot easier. They could set up clinics that deal with just that issue. I think that's a real tough issue though for a lot of those people.
Yeah, and they're wary now as well, because a lot of them are here on there's a specific type of visa, a T visa, that they're here on, and there's a lot in the news, right, about what ICE is doing, and I know the person that I work with, her immigration lawyer said, do you want me to give you a letter that you can carry with you that just explains your immigration status? So if anybody ever asks, all you have to do is take out this letter and show it to them. And she said to me, do you think I should get that? And I said, absolutely. It doesn't, all you're going to do is carry it around in your purse, so there's no downside to having it in case you ever need it. So, for a lot of them, even walking into an IRS office, to an acceptance center or something like that, can be frightening, right?
Because the PTSD, and it breaks my heart to even think that they would get approached by an ICE agent and have to even have been in a situation where they'd have to produce. The amount of PTSD just to sit there and pull that out of your pocket and try to explain your situation to someone that is coming at you in that way is just got to be a tremendous amount of anxiety that is produced, and the mental impact there is going to be very strenuous. Well, look, a lot of great issues here. I really appreciate you coming on the podcast. I do want we're going to get some links to some of the stuff that you talked about so that we can put it on the show notes. I will be championing the cause, and certainly I will want to connect with you about what more we can do with the Wolf Group. But I would encourage anyone that's listening to this podcast that wants to get involved, whether you're a solo practitioner or a small firm, mid-sized firm, even the folks at the big ones, there you can always do more. There will be more expected of us. To those that have more, we can do more. And I would strongly encourage you to, this is an area where I'm telling you, when we've been doing this for a couple of years now, and every time I get done doing a return or helping a person get that return done, there's no better feeling in the world. That feeling of just accomplishment, and these are easy returns, right? They're so straightforward, but the sense of accomplishment I get with getting that done and completing that for that person, and just knowing that maybe I was able to help a certain part of their life just feel normal and easy for a minute. That's an amazing feeling. And I hope everyone, that does what I do can experience that at some point in time.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's something I have that same feeling every time we meet and I do something. It makes you feel good, knowing that you can help someone who's really has had a tough life, and could use some help.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for what you do, David. Thanks for coming on the podcast. We really enjoyed talking to you.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
We'll see you next time.
Okay, take care.
You've been tuning in to the Essential Tax Podcast with your host, Mishkin Santa. You can find this show on all the major platforms, including YouTube, LinkedIn, Apple Podcast, Spotify, and on our website, thewolfgroup.com. Thank you for your positive reviews, comments, questions, and for sharing this show with others.